What keeps you awake at night?
Sea levels are rising globally.
Fears fueled by horror stories.
Among the worst flu season in a decade, and it hasn't peaked yet.
We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous.
Another series of deadly terror attacks.
Because you know that thing your brain does in the middle of the night? This crazy thing where it takes a small problem and it just makes it enormous?
Alright, so story begins. I am taking a quantum mechanics course at UCLA, and I genuinely love quantum mechanics. Like, it's actually one of the few fields of physics that I find super interesting. So I was excited to take the class. On the first couple days, this teacher seemed pretty cool, and then he started giving, like, these moralizing life lessons that were unrelatable at best, and then crisis-inducing at the worst.
Oh,
so,
boy!
I think the first story he ever told was, he likes to take his time. He lives in Manhattan Beach, which has an average home value of like 2.3 million, I think.
Oh, is that the average then?
Yes. And he likes to walk across Manhattan Beach and reflect on physics, and, you know, what's important is to enjoy your life to the fullest. And I was like, wow, okay, can't relate.
Jesus!
And then next week, he had told a story about, well, no, the story started with the phrase, you know, I know you think you guys are gonna live forever, but the human life expectancy is, 80 years? And I just hear Hassan's breath get knocked out of him. Like, he just goes, and then he just dissociates for the rest of class as the teacher continues to say, so it's important to, like, spend your time doing what you love and find passion in your work. And I'm like,
this guy must be just a blast at parties.
Oh, I'm certain, because I thought that was funny. I was like, oh good, Hassan's biggest fear of wasting his life just hit him in the face. And then, lo and behold, next week, he told a story about how he had a student who took his class, and the kid had gotten like a B in the fundamental math course you need for all the upper division physics.
Okay.
And he was like, you know, he got a B, and he turned out to be pretty good at quantum. He just didn't test well. And then one day he came to me and said, I'd like to work in your lab. And he had less than a 3.5, which I guess is like a low for this teacher.
Yeah.
And he gave him an assignment to work with a grad student, and then a week later he went to the teacher and said, I think I know more than the grad student. I think the grad student is making a mistake, which I think is kind of a bold move. But
yeah, wow. Okay, goodwill hunting.
Right? So the teacher, as like a test, assigned him that project just for himself as an undergraduate researcher, which, like, rarely happens in the physics department. Usually in the physics department, you are being you're under someone just because the graduate students need the cred. And this guy got first author in an article, or a research paper rather, that was published in Nature magazine, Nature journal, which is a huge fucking deal. So I'm like, okay, so maybe if you don't test well, you can still be successful.
Sure.
And then he continued this story and said, and he got into every Ivy League, he got into Stanford and UCLA, and he wanted to go to Stanford. And I begged him to stay in my lab because I think he had a great opportunity here. And he went to Stanford, and I guess he just, like, never found his niche there, and I don't think he ever got published again.
Okay.
So there goes my biggest fear in the middle of quantum, and that gave me massive anxiety for like a week. So
what is this guy's deal? Does he just, like, get off to making students panic?
Perhaps. I think that's a possibility. I think he genuinely thinks he's giving good advice, but doesn't realize it's not good advice.
There's no advice. It's just, don't waste your life. No pressure. What the hell is that?
Yeah, and he's casually, like, he makes enough money, clearly, to live in Hermosa Beach.
Yeah, fuck off, dude.
He is interesting. So that's for my own emotional well-being. I've just started reading different things while he gives life advice, because I can't
Whoa.
I can't listen to it because it'll be something actually inspirational paired with something fear-inducing. Like he has a whole speech on finding your passion in your work because, quote, you only have the time in one lifetime to master one thing. And I'm like,
well, that's just blatantly false. Like, okay, I'm sorry. I'm about as cynical as they come, but that's just not true.
yeah.
I'm sorry, like, that pisses me off because when I was studying acting, that was a big deal where people are like, well, if I don't make it by the time I'm 25, then I've completely lost my niche. I can't find work then because I'm not young anymore. I can't play the leads, whatever. There was always, like, a laundry list of reasons why you had to make it before you turned 30, right?
Yeah.
But that's just, there are so many, like, A-list actors that you'd think of now that didn't even start until they were in their mid-40s or 50s.
Yeah.
And, like, the same goes for any fucking field. If you suddenly find that you're good at something, and you're, 50, 60 years old, and you start to pursue that, you can get good at it. If you have a talent for something, there's nothing saying that you can't be successful in that field. That fucks me up when teachers are like, hey, kids whose frontal cortex isn't fucking developed yet, go ahead and find the thing you're good at now because you'll never have time later, because it's just not true. Shit.
Woof. Woof. So on that note, and on the fear-inducing episodes, this is Things That Keep Me Up at Night. I'm Olivia.
Hi, I'm Brooke.
And I'm in a closet. I'm in my
angry.
old new closet, so that's good.
Yay, closets.
Closets.
We're celebrating closets today.
And a round of applause for closets. Cue sound effects. Today, we are beginning our new series.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. On prisons. And now, Brooke had stole my idea, as I had mentioned a couple episodes ago.
It was literal slavery.
I understand that. But it was my topic. I was going to do debtors' prisons. But I found something much worse.
Oh, good. I'm glad I opened the door for you.
So this idea actually came to me a couple, like a month ago or so, just to prove to you that we do listen to DMs and suggestions.
Hey.
We got a DM from a couple months ago from a girl, I think her name is Shanae. That's what is in her username, so I'm gonna guess her name is Shanae. And she was listening to the CIA cover-ups episode, and she suggested to me that I do an episode on Australia, because that's where she's from.
Hell yeah.
And so I was like, okay, well, this is a great topic, because I'm sure Australia has done many a bad thing. And I kind of anticipated that this would be about the transfer of, prisoners to Australia. I didn't know what I was going to find. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know much about Australia. I think as far as understanding goes, I think I know more than most, because my dad absolutely adores Australian cinema. So as a result, in a couple of the films I've seen, I understand a little bit about this concept.
Yeah, you just gather some knowledge.
So, first of all, Australia, this is your episode. You're welcome. Thank you, Shanae.
This one's for Australians.
This one's for you, Australia. Shanae, you're going to be really mad because she wanted to find out what terrible things her country has done. And don't worry, Shanae, your country has done horrible things and is still doing horrible things.
Yay!
So, let's discuss the disproportional incarceration of the Aboriginal people of Australia.
Oh, fuck, Olivia!
Do you know, okay, so just as a qualifier, do you know anything about the history of the Aboriginal people? Just, because this is very Australian-centric, and I would say I knew a bit about this because it was kind of alluded to in some of the films that I've seen.
Yeah, not really. I know of the situation, I just don't know. If somebody asked me explain it, I wouldn't be able to.
Fair enough. And I knew some of it just because I'd seen these movies. I forget the name of the movie, but there's a movie with Chris O'Dowd, and it has 3 Aboriginal sisters who are in, a choir, and they traveled during World War II to perform for troops. And in that movie, it references a... It references a procedure that went on during that time period.
Okay. The fact that you're being clinical about this makes me nervous.
You should be nervous, and we'll talk about that because I think the issue that they discuss in the film is actually the core root of the issue in the disproportionate imprisonment. I'm just going to get into right at the beginning and begin where I start most of my episodes, and that's in the 18th century.
Yeah! And we're back!
Why do we always do this? Well, why do we do this? Why do I do this? So, it all began in 1770. That was around the time that St. James Cook, he first arrived to Australia. And when he first arrived, he took little heed of the people that lived there and vastly underestimated their population size. I don't know if that's a result of he wanted to claim the land more easily and say this was a very small community of people, or, just good old-fashioned, 18th century racism, and they weren't that important to him, so he just looked and squinted at the island and saw, 15, and he's like, there's probably twice as many as that. Hard to say.
Safe bet. Gotta say, anybody could have made the same mistake.
I mean, I would have. No.
God, what a moron.
So in 1788, that was the first fleet that arrived to Australia, captained by Captain Arthur Phillip. At the very least, he was able to discern that this was a large population of natives.
At least somebody brought their thinking cap to the table.
But
did I speak too soon?
And as is common with a lot of European native relations, the Europeans brought with them diseases such as syphilis, influenza, and smallpox.
Fucking Europeans, am I right?
Ain't that just the way?
Ain't that just the way?
In less than a year, half of the population in the Sydney Basin had died from smallpox.
Shit, dude.
Not only was this an isolated community of people, if you think about relations that happened in, let's say, Africa, when they encountered, small settlements there, at the very least, there was some kind of gene exchange that was occurring within the entire area of, Europe and the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Right. And this was, this is a completely isolated group of people that didn't think that anything existed beyond their island, right?
Crazy, yeah.
So, as a result, they were incredibly sheltered from disease. They had zero exchange with any neighboring areas, so they were kind of set up for failure here as far as their immune system goes, because they didn't have the memory cells to combat a large majority of what was being introduced to them.
Yeah, wow.
So I think the racist attitudes kind of began with this idea, which is also pretty similar to the way that America had dealt with the natives there, in that they felt like they weren't utilizing the land, because if you know what Australia looks like, it's kind of a desert. So the indigenous people kind of had this attitude where they were living in balance with their environment and just hunted enough to live. They were generally nomadic because, they took what they needed and then they moved forward. And in the eyes of the Europeans, that meant that they weren't using it,
Yeah, if you don't tap all of your natural resources, what are you even doing?
What's the even fucking point of being there? And this is, as an aside, we talked about this a bit in my neoliberal course. Classical liberalism I discussed a bit is very much that mentality of justified wars. And in a justified war, essentially what you're saying is, the argument was, if the natives aren't using the resources in the most optimal way that they could, it's up for grabs. And if they wanted it, they should lay claim to it in the same manner that Europeans were. That's not explicitly what the philosophers were saying, but that's what it translated to, is this was a justified war. They weren't using it. So quickly, within the time that the first fleet arrived, within that year, the settlers had depleted the ocean of fish because they used large nets to catch the fish.
My God.
They decimated the local kangaroo population and shrunk them to very small numbers. They cleared the land of its
kangaroo?
Yeah, the kangaroo meat. I guess it's pretty gamey.
Okay.
Now you know that. They cleared the land of its natural fauna, and they polluted the water, which, as a result, started to begin to push the natives out of their natural land. They couldn't live there. They can't compete with people that are using industrial means of farming.
Right.
And everything like that. Now, this, I knew this existed. You're gonna know it existed. But I think my brain decided to forget about it because I don't like thinking about this era of racism.
Go figure.
So during the first, communications between these settlers and the indigenous peoples back in the day of the 18th century, a lot of the racism was rooted in this fundamental Christianity kind of complex of if you're not Christian, you're not evolved, and you're not, I guess, of course, in the eyes of God, worthy of living. Like, you know what I mean? They're not Christian peoples, they're savages.
Yeah, right. Like the superior race kind of thing.
Right. And so during about 1880s is when evolution became, more and more accepted, generally speaking, in the scientific community. And it was very common for a lot of scientists to wrap their racism in this new veil of evolution and essentially refit their racist beliefs to be rooted in science. That was the argument. Like
the fucking social Darwinism type shit?
Yes, that evolution exists so that the less fit species die out. And so as a result, the argument was that inferior races would eventually die out by principle of evolution and survival of the fittest. Now,
right, it had nothing to do with the fact that Europeans were just murdering everyone. That had nothing to do with it.
No. We'll talk a lot about why they believed that, which is also pretty heinous. And just to kind of give an example of how widely accepted this ideology was, James Bernard, the vice president of the Royal Tasmania Society, which, as an aside, is a society that is purported to be founded with the intention to advance knowledge. So it's supposed to be like a society of scientists and philosophers rooted in making arguments in scientific fact and logical reasoning. And he had stated...
Were they racist? Olivia, were they racist?
So racist. Unbelievably racist. I have a quote from a speech he gave at the Australian Association for the Advancement of Science. It has become an axiom that following the law of evolution and survival of the fittest, the inferior races of mankind must give place to the highest type of man, and that is this law is adequate to account for the gradual decline in numbers of the Aboriginal inhabitants of a country before the march of civilization.
There's so much to unpack there.
And we don't have the time!
Oh my God. I have to wonder what incites that kind of belief and then that kind of confidence in your belief.
Yeah.
Where you see a different group of people. They look different, they talk different, they act different. And because they don't socialize the way that you do, is it fear that drives you have to believe that they're inferior to you or else... What? I
struggle with that this entire series because I still, even after all of this, I do believe that people are doing their best with respect to their perspective, and that's what's haunting to me, is this is what people truly believe is doing their best.
I don't know about that. I do think that there is that argument in general, where a person as an individual, generally speaking, is doing their best. When you get a group of people in an echo chamber, I don't know if I believe that anymore.
That's fair.
And stuff like this especially is so bizarre to me, where you've got, you land on an island. Let's say you, Olivia, land on an island.
Sick.
And there's a group of 5 people that look completely different to you. Still human, obviously, but they have a different language. They have a different way of doing, business, life, family. It just is completely different from the way that you have been socialized to accept society.
Okay.
What is it that would make you look at them and go, wow, they don't deserve to live?
Well,
I
have an answer for you, if it makes you feel better, but the answer's not going to make you happy.
It probably won't, Olivia.
So let me give you my answer, and then we'll retouch on my perspective here, which makes me sad. So, as I said, racism against Aborigines, Native peoples everywhere never went away. It was just reframed with a scientific lens because, you know, this was post-Enlightenment era, so obviously using a religious argument is going to be more frowned upon. But having...
Yes, religion is so passé.
No, we use science.
It's the same. It's just...
It's the same.
You know,
it's
more
absolutely
words.
the same. It's just different reasons.
Yeah.
And so instead of arguing that any indigenous peoples, anyone of color ever, were a lesser race from a religious standpoint, they just argue that they were inherently less evolved and less intelligent compared to their white race. Jesus. And I've read the primary literature for this, and it's just insane to me. There's the callous unfeeling towards other people. But I don't want to say the callous unfeeling towards other human beings because they didn't believe that they were humans. So... what does that mean? Well, the theory has a lot to do with perspective. So I'll give some examples of research that was being done. Scientists would observe the natural behavior and the cultural values, the religion, everything about these indigenous peoples, the Aboriginals of Australia. And they would observe, for instance, that some tribes existed at a state of sexual evolution primitive to ours that would evolve into monogamy, right? So because they didn't have the same system of, you know, sex and purity and marriage, their definitions of marriage and family are at a state primitive to ours, and ours is kind of the apex in evolution, right?
Right, and I'm sure that applied to many things.
Oh, of course, right? So they observed their hunting and tracking patterns, and they linked them to primitive societies in the Stone Age. They liken their religious tradition to the precursors of modern religions, such as Christianity. So those examples, for instance, all kind of reaffirm this fact that they're looking for means of proving that these peoples lived at a state prior to ours. So the end state of evolution is ours. So they just looked at anything different and they say, oh, this must be the thing that came before our thing because we're at the end. Right?
Look, I mean, even if that were true, which it just isn't. But, like, even if it was, why does that inherently make them undeserving of life? Like,
well, I got more.
Okay. Oh, good. Great.
You think I'm done?
Yeah, 22 minutes. That's it, folks.
No. So they continued on past just cultural values and anthropology.
Sure.
They took skull measurements.
Yeah.
And they compared them to that of the Neanderthal skull to prove empirically that the skull of the Aborigine limited brain growth and development, preventing them from emotionally developing past the age of a white child. Their argument was that, like, in the womb, the fissure that wraps around the brain closes several developmental periods earlier than ours, so it's impossible for them to be as intelligent, which I don't even know how you prove that.
Yeah, there's no possible way.
But sure, they deliberately went out of their way to compare the behaviors of the Aborigines to that of apes to see if there was a missing link. Essentially, and when I read further into this, when Darwinian evolution was finally accepted, something that was very difficult to reconcile was that Darwin had created this theory upon the basis of development and evolution in, say, animals or birds or turtles, right?
Right.
But very little was to be said for humans because there weren't archaeological records of the link between apes and humans. And he had proved empirically that there was some kind of link. But for a lot of people who kind of didn't like the idea that we were evolved from the simian species and apes, is that, you know, there's no proof that we do. So essentially there was a large group of scientists that were trying to find some means of proving that there were links between apes and human beings. Human beings as in white people. So they truly believed that these indigenous peoples that they were encountering were the missing link between apes and humans. So they were not humans, they were living fossils.
Oh my god.
So
I'm sorry, that's so much dead air, but Jesus,
which is just crazy to me because the research was not being done to learn more about them. The research was being done to prove that they were the bridge between the gap between primates and white men. Oh my god,
they're just like the fucking flat earthers.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
They just had a hypothesis and went about proving that hypothesis and nothing else.
Yeah.
Shit.
So I think part of this is, one, they're trying to prove the link because they have this drive to find this bridge, this big vacant data space, right, of we have no evidence, and we're so interested in finding that. And also, I think it's a very valid way, in their eyes, not my eyes, to justify their racism, because it's not racist, it's fact, right? I mean, this is pretty common. They had the skull measuring for years. If you recall, during the era of slavery in the U.S., they would measure the skulls of the African Americans that we had taken from Africa. That's a whole nother fucking episode. Saying that, like, dents in the skull proved that they were incapable of learning manners as much as we were. Like, this has existed for a very long time, and I think the illusion that it's rooted in science is very alluring for people that want to feel confident in things that are, I think, inherently uncomfortable.
Oh, sure.
You know, just as a social species. But if you have the fact to back up your horrible, horrible feelings, then you don't feel so bad, because it's not racist. It's true. This is kind of the vibe I got from this whole era.
Yeah, it's just the smugness with which they speak and write. It's like, well, I know this because I'm a man of science, so you can't prove me wrong. And it's like, dude, just shove your whole head up your ass, please.
No, I agree. It's pretty heinous.
It's very, like, Rudyard Kipling's White Man's
100%.
Burden.
Yeah.
Ugh.
And so this whole era was defined as the doomed race era, because they gave these instances saying that this was the link between humans and apes, and their presumed extinction would be the result of their predisposition to fall victims to the vice of civilization, such as alcohol and drugs. There was this argument that they were just not developed enough to be able to navigate the vices of civilization, right? So that their undoing would be chronic alcoholism or drug use or something like that.
You mean the vices that they plied the Aboriginal people with to get them to be more compliant and also dead?
Yes.
Yeah, right. Okay, cool.
Yeah. And this not only applied to Aborigines, like, if you recall, you've been in American history, this was applied to anybody who was of color, like black slaves. They would also apply this too, which is why they were restrictive to them. My favorite part of this is that a lot of this research and data on their predisposition to alcoholism and substance abuse was not on any supported census data, which, even if it was census data, was largely disputed because of the definition of Aborigine, and that's just in Australia alone. It would be people walking through, let's say, a rural town largely populated by people of color, and they would say they're drinking like crazy. They're just not equipped to deal with the ills of society. Like, just
but a white dude who goes into a bar and gets completely smashed is fine.
No, he's fine.
Cool.
Yes. So, and it was the result of their incapability as a race to adapt to modern society. That was the argument. Sure. And so sometimes, which is I thought was so interesting, is sometimes it was the result of that genetic incapability, right? Sometimes it was the Chinese. And I don't understand this argument. They argued that the Chinese trade of opium was exacerbating the wiping out of all of these indigenous peoples, which they didn't even think of as bad. They just thought it was true. What does that even mean? I don't even understand that argument.
I have no idea. What?
I can't understand any of these arguments.
Whatever.
But anyway, regardless of who is at fault, it was just an exacerbating factor for the extinction. It was literally just generally accepted as fact that they were going to be extinct. And it was just a matter of time. Now,
so why not hurry it along?
In the doomed race theory, the scientific axiom of the late 19th century, which is a book that I read a chapter on that was on this era. Very good, honestly. The writing was incredible. Like, the writing style is really great. And the author aptly summarizes this period of history as Aborigines, including legislation, administration, employment, and even to some extent missionary efforts, can be understood only in the context of a firm conviction that they had not long to live.
Well,
right.
That's good.
So the further exploitation, slavery is part and parcel to the dehumanization of Aboriginal people. And so during this era, Aboriginal slaves were often sold to pearling ships, which expected them to dive sans equipment to the ocean floor in search for pearls. And these people were generally collected by people that were called blackbirders. And so Colonel E.F. Angelo, a government resident at the time, describes them as publicly advertising themselves to produce and put niggers aboard 5 pounds a head for anybody or shoot them for the government at half a crown apiece. Which is insane to me.
That word was used about the Aboriginal people as well?
Yes. So as a point of clarification, in Australia, the Aboriginals are considered black. So they refer to them as black people or dark-skinned or just the N. They've also used Negro, same context for whatever reason.
Wow.
Which was interesting to me because we refer to Native Americans as Native Americans. It's completely different, like, subgrouping.
Yeah.
But here, they refer to as black people. Yes.
I had no idea. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, no, that's important because
that's
in reading, if you read more on this, when referring to black people in Australia, they're probably generally referring to the Aboriginal people or like natives. So, again, back to these pearling ships, obviously they were in conditions that, were just absolutely horrible. If they returned empty-handed, they were often beaten and then pushed back in until they returned with pearls.
Oh boy.
Thousands of people died from work-related injuries, beatings, malnourishment, and this part made my jaw drop. Their bodies were purchased by wealthy Europeans to study in museums or keep on display in their homes.
Keep on display.
Because they wanted to have, like, Aboriginal skulls. Like, they're like, oh, look at these, like, really interesting niche group of people that we discovered.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
Which, as an aside, over the past 30 years in Australia, 1,500 skeletons have been returned to Aboriginal tribes and communities for proper burials. But currently, 2,000 are still abroad.
Can you imagine being a person and then finding out that, like, your great-grandfather has this skeleton that he's just been keeping as a trophy from, like, your family? That's insane.
Yeah, and, like, and there's this weird argument of, like, well, we need, like, these, like, Aboriginal skeletons to, like, show the development of man and, like, have a historical context. Like, they're currently presented in museums in Europe as, like, we're showing this part of history, but obviously these Aboriginal communities are like, these are our people. We would like to bury them.
Take a fucking picture. Even that is crossing a line, but fuck, dude.
Yeah. And so, it's just devastating, and for them this is so culturally and religiously significant.
Yeah.
Like, I don't... The fact that this happened, period, is horrible, but the fact that they're still abroad is insane to me.
That there are people who are justifying hanging on to...
people's family members. Yeah.
Yes.
Acquired in a very unethical way, but that's just me. Anyway, so here's the bad middle part where white people save the day, which now, let me qualify. I was drinking some rosé while I was writing this script, and this middle part was a little heated, so I had to look back at it and be like, woof, I was angry because...
That makes a little bit of sense, though.
Yeah, I was reading the primary literature, and I laughed out loud at the the wild justifications of the Australians during this time period. So, here we go. So, to the displeasure of English colonists, Aborigines fought against them using guerrilla tactics such as burning shelters, ripping up crops, and driving away livestock. So now their money is being affected, right? So now they care. And so over a series of decades, the Aboriginal people were pushed to the very fringes of their original land. Now, missionaries had initially tried to convert them to Christianity and give them a, quote, proper white education at the detest of most of the elders who thought that it would be wiping away their religious, like, history and word of mouth, and obviously their language is important to them, so they were like, hard pass, and it was unsuccessful. So the missionaries, who failed at that, found the natives destitute enough to warrant their help when they were at the very fringes of land that were incapable of sustaining life. Which is infuriating, to say the least. And so, as a passion project, clearly I've had like 2 glasses of wine when I'm writing this. As a passion project, the missionaries implored the government to give them reservations in which to live. Which is so infuriating that now that white people ask, now they get help. But actually, it did work because they had somewhere to live. And for a brief moment, they had somewhere to live.
Okay, but like...
Not their native land and the shittiest land they could possibly be afforded.
Right. So that's what I was going to say, is that, like, the reservation thing never works out in favor of the people who are being forced onto reservations.
Right.
So no, I think didn't work out.
No. I remember there was a piece of primary literature I read for the neoliberalism class, and it was from the perspective of a Native American who said that they had left their land because it was viable cropland to the middle of the desert in Arizona, Oklahoma area. Sure, and then they discovered oil, and then they were immediately required to go back to their original land that had been deforested and decimated. The fertile land was no longer viable. So it was essentially just move wherever is unimportant so we can make use of the resources. Yeah. Pretty much the same here. And so now begins the big sad bad.
Oh, was this not up until now?
You're gonna be, this is actually might be one of the worst things I've read about white people doing to people of color.
Well, there's a lot of it, so...
It goes from 1869 to 1970. Are you ready?
I'm not at all.
But
we could just stop now.
Okay. If you could follow us on Twitter. No, this is...
God, how many times are we gonna do that joke?
Until I find it not funny anymore, which is never.
So never.
Yes.
Yeah, cool.
So, here begins the system of absorption.
I don't like it. Already, I hate it.
Yes. So, census statistics, as I said, were hardly reliable in measuring the population of Aborigines. They were very sparse, so depending on what group that you were assessing, people got anywhere from 15,000 to 20,000 to maybe close to the 100,000s. It was kind of all over the place, so...
Yeah, that sounds like not a census.
Nope. And so it was kind of hard to discern whether or not they were, quote, dying out, as the words of the racists said. And so there began concern because there were mixed-race children being born.
Go figure.
Right? And this was not mixed children of consent. I don't want to say that. I don't want my point to be misconstrued. It was very common for white people to set up shop and establish a small harem. There is somebody I quoted in here much later whose great-great-grandfather owned a pearling business and had 8 Aborigine wives, right? So I don't want to misconstrue my point, not to mention all of the other horrible things that have occurred to indigenous communities across the board when white people showed up. So,
not to get clinical, but I do have a question. So, the running theory was that the Aboriginal people were not human.
Right.
What did they do about the whole problem of producing viable offspring?
I'm not really quite sure if scientists knew what they were doing.
Fair enough.
I think towards the end of this period, they stopped believing them to be not humans. They just believed them to be lesser than them.
Great.
So
and let's just call it what it is.
Racism.
Science, right. Science was always going to try and find a way to back up what they already believed, which is that the Aboriginal people were worse than white people.
100%.
Cool.
Yep. Same page.
Neat.
All on the same page. So, as I said, census statistics were kind of all over the place.
Sure.
Mixed race children were being born, which they referred to as half-caste because,
That's
racism.
horrifying. Yeah.
And in 1869, the Aboriginal Protection Boards began to be set up in multiple states, and these were set up with the intention of controlling the activities, regulating the income and employment of Aboriginal people. So
That's always great.
right, so essentially just like micromanaging their finances. If they were given like an endowment of money from like the death of a family member, they would regulate whether or not they would receive said money. They had to approve employment contracts through them. They had their religious and cultural traditions greatly repressed. So this began key interest again as mixed race children began rising because, obviously in the eyes of scientists, that meant that indigenous people weren't dying out, which was a problem for racist people. So they had no legal rights to control these people. It was more withholding rations and rail passes to people they deemed unworthy, kind of muscling them into doing what they wanted.
Sure.
Some Aboriginals were able to purchase land, but the activities were heavily monitored. And essentially the board at this time started having concerns that they weren't able to properly manage and regulate the Aboriginal people because they were considered a nuisance by white society and they needed more legal rights to manage them. So from anywhere from 1909 to 1915, in waves, the boards were granted extensive powers from Australian government officials, such as the legal guardianship over all Aboriginal children born in the state.
I'm sorry, you're saying all white people were the legal guardians of all Aboriginal children?
Yes.
Huh.
So what does this mean? So, since its
That's an awesome
establishment,
question.
the board sought to remove mixed-race Aborigines, known as half-castes, from their homes with the intention that they would be able to be re-socialized by white families, because they might be half Aboriginal, but they have the capability to be re-socialized and integrated into white society. And the children that I'm going to be describing henceforth are called the stolen generation, which was just a generation of children that were taken from their parents' homes. So,
Holy shit.
legally speaking, they were only afforded so much leeway in doing this. They couldn't just, like, grab them and leave during this time period.
Small blessing.
They were required to prove in a court that these children were being legally, in, like, a legal sense, neglected or mistreated, and that their situation would vastly improved if they were living in a different environment. And by different environment, I mean a white household.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it probably wasn't terribly difficult for people to prove that.
Actually, at this time, it was only, and this is the point that's in here, they grew frustrated because they were required to prove that the child was being neglected. But here's the issue, is this is their argument, not a legal argument. They said a child would only need to appear in the least bit of taken care of to be considered in good care, and they had to go through the law to remove them from their homes, and the parents would be aware of their intentions and would leave or would not cooperate, quote, no matter how good of an opportunity it would be for the children. Right. So essentially, because of the time period, like, they would just fucking leave, which
Sure.
I would. And
Yeah.
if you're considering the conditions the Aborigines were already in, which I'm sure is extreme poverty, it was hard for them to prove in comparison that it was like a situation of neglect. So around 1909 to 1915, like I said, this was kind of the era of taking them from the homes. That was the period when they had full legal rights to remove children from their homes without the inconvenience of taking them to court. So prior to 1909-ish, depending on the state that you're in, you would have to prove it. From henceforth, they didn't have to prove it anymore.
Was there an inciting incident, or was it just a bunch of white people saying, we don't want to do this?
There was a bunch of white people saying that, making the argument that Indigenous people were inherently less capable of caring for their children. The children would fare better in white society or institutions. I mean, there was obviously a clear issue of people, generally speaking, saw them as a massive inconvenience.
Sure.
So it was not that difficult for them to argue that they needed full rights to take the children from the home.
See, that was what I was thinking it originally was going to be, that they would just go to court and say, I'm white, so it's better. But I guess they just did that on a system-wide basis then.
Yeah. So
okay.
This vastly increased the removal of children, and from 1918 and 1920, the board recruited quote-unquote home finders that would, in my words, abduct the children from their homes. And the police were an extension of the board, and as a result would be enforcing their restrictions, work orders, but most importantly, the removal of children, right? So it was completely in their legal right to drive to a house, remove any half-caste or, like, more white children, and they had to fill out paperwork for rehousing. Obviously, it wasn't just, like, removing them. But I think that the paperwork is a little bit of a Kafkaesque illusion of law, because the home finder or police officer would be required to list the reason for removing them from the home. Okay. Here are a couple of explanations, and I don't know which one is worse. So I'm going to read them for you, and you tell me which one is the worst one. Okay?
Oh my god. Okay.
For being Aboriginal, to send to service, being 14 years, at risk of immorality, neglected, to get her away from surroundings of Aboriginal station / removal from idle reserve life, and orphan. Which one is worse?
I gotta say that for being Aboriginal is probably the worst one, just objectively speaking.
Yep.
For being 14?
Right, so that one is the reference that previously, before they had the legal right to, like, remove them from the home without much of an explanation, 14 years is the bare minimum, like, this is the minimum age that you can send kids to do apprenticeships. So for white children, they would be kind of under the rights of their father, and if they were sent to a situation where they were doing their apprenticeship and they failed, they would be sent back to their father. But in the Aboriginal system, they would be essentially sent to be domestic servants or slaves. And much later, they're going to lower that age for Aboriginal children so they could go to work sooner. But essentially, what this translated to legally is they'd go to homes, be like, oh, cool, this one can work, we're taking them.
Cool.
And
so that's pretty bad.
And I want to clarify, this whole period, they were specifically targeting half-caste children or any children that were even, like, more white. They weren't really looking at taking full Aboriginal children because they weren't of much interest to them. Because, again, their ideal scenario would be that these half-caste or even more white children would be adopted or employed or marry lower-class white people, which would effectively eliminate our Aboriginal blood. So that's kind of like the purpose. And I want to clarify that, because essentially they were going to these places and be like, he looks whiter, and then take them, right?
Yeah, no, I got it. I'm just speechless.
Yeah.
This is...
I just want to this period was straight up, they were fully aware they were trying to extinguish the Aboriginal race, which is going to change, but I want to clarify that now. So some children were placed in schools to be trained for domestic service or were made indentured servants to white families. In 1921, about 81% of the children removed were female. And they were commonly victims to sexual abuse, and when they fell pregnant, they would be forced to carry the baby to term and then have them removed and rehomed immediately after their birth. So there are stories where these girls who are very young would give birth and not even be able to hold their child, where the child was taken away and rehomed in a white family. Which is just horrible.
It's horrifying.
Just... so outwardly racist. And another means of collecting the young came as a result of shrinking reserved land. So I said earlier that they had created reserved lands for the Aborigines. Some Aborigines were able to own land, if you recall. So as a result of policies that distributed cropland to World War I veterans, which is about 1917-ish, there was, and as well as like a growing pastoral economy, Aboriginals were kind of pushed off their land by white people who wanted this viable cropland and area to raise livestock. And so the Aboriginals were pushed off their land and into these reservations. So as a result, the board requested that they redefine what it means to be Aboriginal. So what this means in many cases and in many states, you were only Aboriginal if you were full-blooded Aboriginal. So anybody who is half caste, and I don't remember the name of the other ones, but there's Quadroon and Octoroon, which means you're a fourth and an eighth Aboriginal respectively.
They had sort of a similar thing where like half like mixed race kids of like one was black, one was white, they would be called, I think, almost the exact same thing.
Yeah, something like that. So, and essentially what that meant is if you had any child that was half caste, Quadroon, Octoroon, it would be way easier to remove them from the family because they weren't technically protected under the Aboriginal laws and reservations.
I see.
And it was also pretty common practice. Like I said, they weren't taking these full-blooded Aboriginal children to be rehomed in white homes. They weren't interested in that. They would kind of institutionalize full-blooded Aboriginal children. They were exploiting a law at the time for juvenile crime laws. And so any community that defied this board or tried to evade them or tried to move, they would be kind of subject to these, I would call them raids, where they would take full-blooded Aboriginal children or they would take any of the you know what I'm trying to say. I'm just going to say half-caste just as a general explanation of anyone that was
I fucking hate that term.
I hate it.
It's
fucking awful, but it's what by law they were using. And so you were kind of muscled into, like, if you want to keep your kids, you're going to play nice.
Right, of course.
And so by 1920, including kind of the variance you have in the census, by 1920, there was only about 20,000 Aboriginals that remained from a population that was estimated to be anywhere from 300,000 to 1 million Aboriginals in 1788. Oh my God. And so that low number of 20,000, I'm going to make a caveat to, because as you remember, they redefined Aboriginal. So I'm guessing most likely that number is only full-blooded Aboriginals because they had narrowed it.
Yeah,
Which is just horrible. So, 1927 to 1975, things began changing a little bit. Post-World War II, people were taken aback by the effects of racism, which is insane to me. This is like a historical conclusion that after World War II, many countries across the globe had, like, looked back and they're like, wow, these are the effects of segregating people and treating people with less respect, which blows my mind.
No. What?
So, the Child Welfare Act of 1939 was passed that, as an effect on the board, now required that the board legally prove that they were neglected or uncontrollable. And I will say this actually is an improvement to the previous laws because but it's not great.
Man.
I'm not about to tell you it's great. It's going to be worse. But it definitely made it more difficult. They weren't able to just send police out and say, okay, get your child in my van because they're half caste. Right? Which is what was happening before. And so, yes, they had to prove in court that they were neglected, but if you're proving neglect, poverty, frequent traveling for, let's say, work or evading the board, and resistance to non-Indigenous control were all indicative of neglect and as you can imagine, are very common to the Aboriginal experience. Right. You can't just, pull a poor person from a group of poor people and say, wow, they're poor, we need to take their kid.
Right, like, that's what I was saying, is it's the same.
Right. Oh, yeah, no, I read, like, multiple papers on this and really couldn't understand how it was different. It was just branded differently.
Right, yeah.
And additionally, like, the large majority of Aborigines were living on these reservations far from child courts, so it was very difficult for them to travel to the legal proceedings, especially if the board is still in charge of their rail passes, and they were offered no legal assistance. So, what a Kafkaesque world that these people are living in.
There is no winning.
And now they were no longer legal, like the board was no longer legal guardians. They were wards of the board, which actually, legally speaking, did restrict what they were able to do for the children. But it got worse. The segregation got worse.
And then it got worse.
They took these children and they segregated them by skin color. So lighter-skinned Aborigines were sent to white homes or sent to be educated in white institutions under the guise that they were white, because they were fair-skinned. So darker-skinned Aborigines suffered a worse fate. This part, I was a little drunk for this, made me think about when Peter Griffin is going across the Mexican border, and he's like, hold on, I got it, like the Border Patrol pulls him over, he's like, hold on, I gotta check, and he holds up like one of those paint chips that they have at Home Depot, and it's just the two whitest shades say okay, and then anything darker than that says not okay. That reminded me of this, because that's picked them up and just sifted them and then distributed them as needed. And
Jesus.
This period, I'm going to say they weren't doing it with the explicit purpose of extinguishing the Aboriginal race, which is bizarre. They were doing it because they just believed that inherently the children were going to be better off in white homes.
Yeah, so you know how, like, there's that experiment where you have, like, 6 monkeys in a cage, and then anytime any one of them tries to go up a ladder, you spray them with water? And then you replace the monkeys one at a time, and every time the new monkey tries to go up the ladder, the other ones beat the shit out of it.
Yep.
It's a lot like that.
It's a lot like this. And this is just another instance of rebranded racism. It's not about inherently race, it's that just Aboriginal people are just not fit to parent their children well, and the children are going to be much better off in these facilities where they can be trained.
It's not about racism, it's just that race is worse. God, come on.
Insane.
What's
it's
so hard to understand?
Ugh. And so this also blew my fucking mind, because in the previous period, they didn't need to seek consent. And now they did, because as I said, they weren't legal guardians, they were wards. So as a result, the board was required to seek consent from the parent. Now, they returned to coercing the parents to give up their children through, like, threats or muscling. But they also preyed upon the fact that these people were generally illiterate.
Yep. Dude, they did this in America, too.
Yeah, they did.
Shit.
And so adoption papers were run through the Child Welfare Department, but consent was acquired and obtained by the board. The Child Welfare Department just, like, never checked up on it. I don't think they ever cared to, if I'm going to be honest. And quoting a confidential account from working with Indigenous Australians, which, by the way, working with Indigenous Australians gave me so many good, like, stories and information. It's a wonderful website. I believe you can donate to them, just like a casual plug, because most of this is very, very difficult to find online. The large majority of my information was from organizations dedicated to helping Aboriginal people. Very little of this is being reported in the general news.
That's awesome.
Which is
not that it's not being reported, but
that they're doing something about it.
Yeah, exist.
Which is great. So let me read that quote now.
Okie dokie.
Because my mother wasn't educated, the white people were allowed to come in and do whatever they wanted to do. All she did was sign papers. Quite possibly, she didn't even know what she signed. The biggest hurt, I think, was having my mom chase the child welfare car, and I'll always remember it. We were looking out of the window, and my mom was running behind us and singing out for us. They locked us in the police cell up here, and Mom was walking up and down outside the police station, crying and screaming out for us. There was 10 of us. And this was in the 1960s.
Oh my god, in the 60s?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. These children were then placed in girls' homes where abuse was, needless to say, rampant. Even for the boys, it was very common for boys to be placed in Catholic boys' homes, which I don't need to go into why that was fucked up.
If you want to hear more about that, I did an episode about it.
And it's exactly what you think it is. Yeah. So, rampant abuse, as I said, it's the same thing. The women were sexually abused and they became pregnant, and cyclic process of taking the children. They would go to the women in the hospital and have them sign it in the hospital and just take the child away. As I said, there were stories of women who couldn't even hold their child after they gave birth. It was just taken. So in the early 80s, this policy was phased out, and I'm skipping a lot of this because this isn't, like, my topic. This is background. We're at an hour, and I'm not even at my topic, but my topic is brief. So in the early 80s, this was phased out. The policy of removing children from Aboriginal homes was phased out. Thank God. Doesn't do anything about the fact that during this policy, about 1 in 10 to 1 in 3 children were taken from their homes from 1910 to 1970. And this period...
that's so recent.
It's so recent. And this period had a lasting impact on police-Aboriginal relations to this day. That's what I'm going to discuss, because I feel, first of all, I have very little information on just the police in general because it's not being reported. And I feel that it is only appropriate to make people understand, one, how recent this was, because change cannot be made radically with this little time. It's been 50 years, right?
Yeah, if that.
If that. I mean, I remember this was the thing that happened in that movie with Chris O'Dowd. I remember seeing the scene. I said, what happened? My dad explained that they would take the whiter children from homes and rehome them. I just didn't realize how prevalent it was.
Right.
It just, and I've read, so I texted her last night that I needed to take a break from researching this because I actually started crying. Because, and that's the first time this has ever happened to me. Because I've never, actually, cried from researching. Yeah. But there was this series of pictures that I found in a New York Times article. The author escapes me, I'm so sorry. The New York Times article reports on these photos of the stolen generation. And it's just, first of all the people are old. They're in their, 60s and
right, yeah.
Seeing that, you realize they're never going to see their parents. Their parents died, right?
Yeah.
And so you see these just sad faces talking about the abuse they faced. God, there was one lady, her name was Maureen Hunter, and she had said she began looking into her family history as an adult, and she didn't even know where to go with it because... And her words were, I don't even know my mother's real name.
Oh my God.
Which just...
Yeah, there was no way for them to find
from an identity
family.
Standpoint, that's going to fuck you up forever. There was another woman in the article, Retta Dixon, and she said, I think that's what upset us most, the fact that we didn't know where we came from. We didn't know where our family was. We didn't know who we belonged to, which is a pretty common phenomena for just mixed-race peoples because... they didn't really belong in white society because of racism, but they also didn't really belong in Aboriginal society anymore because as a result of them being rehomed, they no longer speak their native language, which for a lot of people is devastating to them. They don't know any of their cultural history. They don't even know where to start. They don't know the name of their parents. They don't know... By
the time you're old enough to realize what the hell happened.
Right?
There's no way to... Yeah.
And in this article, I think it was in this article, or the one from the Aboriginal people, working with Indigenous Australians website, there was one woman who found her mother when she was like 18, and her mother was so happy to see her, and she said that her mother had been raped in the place that she was at, and she got pregnant, and they knew that they were going to take the baby, so she ran away and was homed in a nunnery for a bit, and it was very apparent if she gave birth to the baby, they were going to take it away, so she ran again, and she was captured, and she said she signed something that she couldn't even read, and she never got to see her daughter. Oh my God. And her mother's comment when she had seen her, it was, it was just very apparent to me that they never wanted me to have that child. And she did all that she could to keep her, but everyone was against her on keeping the child. So all of this combined, all of it, is the reason that Aboriginal people don't trust the police or authority, which I think is very understandable, right?
Jesus.
So that translates to today, because this was not that recent, not that long ago that this ended. To this day, Aboriginals face harsh discrimination in the justice system. They're arrested for minor offenses, like unpaid fees, swearing. There was one instance where a guy threw a sock at an officer and was arrested for assault.
Jesus Christ.
The police are known to threaten individuals with their gun or swear at them. When they account these situations where officers are interacting with Aboriginal teenagers or children, one of the first things they do is take away their phones so they can't record them, which I'm pretty sure is illegal, but...
For sure. That's an illegal search and seizure for sure.
Who knows if the laws actually protect them, because I don't know much about Australia. There's... This made me sad. This was a count from elders talking about the cyclical criminal system, or I guess the incarceration of the Indigenous peoples, is that from a very young age, these officers follow them around at all times, watch them at all times, and then arrest them for minor offenses, thus tarnishing their record. And then as a result, they engage in criminal behavior, which reinforces the belief of the cops that they are criminals. So cops are going into these situations with Aboriginals, assuming that they're already criminals, and then just doing things that reinforce that, which is so fucked up.
It's very reminiscent of the way that, just the climate of police and black relations.
Yes.
It's very similar. You see videos of police officers following black teenagers into convenience stores and just following them around.
Just making sure they don't, fuck off, and,
right?
And it doesn't help that a large majority of these kids are born to parents that were from the stolen generation. That's not...
Right. Yeah.
That's not good, right? So it's this whole culture of, I've never had a good relationship with a police officer. Why would I trust them? And then the only interaction they've had with authority is supremely negative and devastating.
Right.
So then they're not really willing to speak to officers in a polite or friendly way, which I think is more than fair. And then other people are like, well, they should have listened to the police officer. And I'm like,
why didn't they just cooperate with the law?
Fuck off. Ugh.
You have no idea what you're talking about.
And so this next section, I'm going to talk about police brutality. So this is straight up a trigger warning, and we'll put the timestamp in the description.
Right.
But before
we move on, the author of that article, the slideshow you talked about, Matthew Sherwood.
And there's a series of 19 pictures. It's incredible. Thank you. I forgot to write it down, and my tabs won't open when I'm on FaceTime, and that's frustrating to me.
Great.
So, trigger warning ahead, just letting you know. So, this is trigger for abuse and stuff like that.
Yeah.
September 2008, a video was released showing that Kevin Spratt, an Indigenous Australian, was being removed from his cell and then was tased 11 times.
Holy shit!
While naked and restrained. So he'd been arrested earlier that night for acting resistance toward police officers. And in the... I forget the specific name of it in Australia, but essentially the hold... When the police officers were talking to him, because he was resistant, he was tased and then stripped and then tased multiple times, sequentially. and he's sustained life-threatening injuries where...
Yeah, I was gonna say, is he alive?
He is alive. He sustained
Holy
life-threatening
shit.
injuries. There's a video of this, which is why we know of it, where the prison doctor examined him and ordered an x-ray, and the police said, no, we're not going to give him an x-ray. So after
my
him
God.
moaning for a day, they took him to the doctor, and he had sustained injuries where he had a punctured lung, broken ribs, and a dislocated shoulder, and it was conclusively found that all of these were from blunt force trauma. There were like 7 officers handling this single man, which I think is obscene. You don't need to do that, right?
Well, it's never a question of need, Olivia.
Yeah, it's just disgusting. So that's one. So in January of 2012, Terrence Briscoe was arrested for public drunkenness and put into protective custody. And witnesses at the scene said that he had drunkenly swung at one of the officers, and it caused no damage because he was drunk. But the police officers pushed him to the ground. One of them sat on him, and the rest pushed them down with their feet so hard that he had trouble breathing and started bleeding.
Holy shit!
And so he'd sustained a head wound and was unconscious, and they placed him in his cell face down on his mattress with his head, like, tilted at a weird angle. And a nearby cellmate implored the officers to seek medical attention because he could hear moaning and labored breathing, and they ignored him for more than 2 hours without checking in on him, which is against protocol because they just didn't care. And he was declared dead from suffocation. Obscene. Insane. No justice was served for that, by the way. Yeah, neither of these, there was really anything done.
Remember how earlier you said that you generally believe that people are doing their best?
So we'll talk about it at the end, because I have a lot to say about that.
Okay.
I have much to say about that, because this next one I had to take a lap around my apartment.
Yeah, you know it's bad when you gotta get up and just walk it out.
I couldn't look at the screen. So there's a woman in August of 2014. Her name is, I don't know how to pronounce this. I've never had a ton of experience in pronouncing, like, Aboriginal names. So I'm going to say it's Miss Dew. But also this is a shortened version of her name because for cultural reasons, they don't want to release her full name.
Right.
And so she was arrested for unpaid fines amounting to about $3,600, right?
Okay.
Which is, as an aside, one of the measures that, like, Aboriginal representatives are taking is that people shouldn't be jailed for fines, especially if this is a community of people that is poor and poverty is pretty common, but that's just an aside. So for her first night, she complained of a pain in her chest, and when she was taken to the doctor, they said, how would you rate it out of 10? And she said 10.
Okay.
I'm gonna list the doctor here because fuck you. Annie Lang, the doctor on site, said she believed she was in pain, but that it was for behavioral gain. So she gave her a known drug addict, an opiate-level painkiller, and a muscle tranquilizer.
Did she die?
Well, no, she was alive. She woke up the next morning, and she said pain was radiating throughout her entire body. After imploring officers to take her, they took her to the hospital again, and a different doctor saw her this time. And Alice Hetherington also believed this was for behavioral gain, but from drug withdrawal, because the day before she was arrested, she had a point of meth, which, in my understanding, I guess is like, I guess she had less of a point of meth, so that's like, I guess a dose for somebody that's like new to meth, but she had regularly used meth. So I'm just going to go out and say she was probably not having withdrawals from a very low dose of meth. Right?
Yeah.
But it's on her...
Also, I just have a quick question. Did nobody actually examine her?
This one, the second time she was in the hospital, they did an ultrasound and found nothing. But Alice, the doctor, and the medical staff, and the jailers, and the officers all believed that she was a user and she was just having withdrawals, and so therefore her pain was less significant because she was a drug addict. They didn't...
Right, because everybody knows that the second you take drugs, you become not a person anymore.
Yeah, So they gave her an ultrasound. They put her back in her cell. She was in pain so bad that she couldn't stand up to shower. So, and this is on footage, I believe, an officer grabs her arm and pulls her up into an upright position. She falls and she hits her head on the floor. They don't examine her for that. And they finally, after hours, agree to take her to the hospital again, where they, like, roughly lift her up, where one officer is lifting her, like, arms and the other's lifting her legs in, like, one of those dangling positions. They put her in the vehicle to take her to the hospital. On the way out of the vehicle, they hit her head again. They put her in a wheelchair, and her head is, like, hanging unsupported in the back, and her feet are dragging on the floor. Just no fucking effort to take her to a hospital. Like, I put those details in there because it's just, there's literally no justification to do that. They did not treat her like a human being, right?
Yeah.
Upon her arrival, even though they said, oh, she's just a drug addict, she's doing it for attention, it's just withdrawals, I don't think the doctor was listed at this point, but the doctor said, no, she's had a heart attack. And
that's what I thought. And
they spent about 54 minutes trying to revive her, but she had died. So she was in custody for 2 days before she died. And the diagnosis was an infection in the rib that had been broken about 3 months prior by her partner. And I asked Hassan, I said how, like, easy it is to diagnose a broken rib. He said, if you don't do an x-ray, it's pretty difficult. But if they did an x-ray, it would have been very apparent. Like, they just needed to do an x-ray.
Look, I've got 2 levels of anger, and one of them is yelling, and one of them is silence. And I know this is not good radio, but my brain can't function knowing that this woman didn't just die, was systematically tortured for $3,600.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And those are my 3, like, those are 3 stories that have made a ton of news. Again, it's been mentioned by activists that they don't release the data on the arrested.
Sure.
So they're kind of, like, scrambling to get any...
This is probably happening all the time.
Oh, all the time. There have been laws in place that have been protecting prisoners. I'm sorry. White Australians for decades. But in the past 30 years, I think 407 Indigenous people have died in custody. Right. Which is too many.
Yeah.
1 is too many. 407 is way too many.
Yeah, that's fucking heinous.
I've seen... So, prisoners at risk of self-harm and suicide are commonly placed alone in their cell or in cells with hanging points, which is against protocol. If somebody is in any state where it's, like, their life is in danger, they're supposed to be put with somebody else so that they can at least be monitored, and definitely not put in a cell where they can hang themselves.
Go figure.
I've seen pictures of teenagers strapped to chairs, naked, with bags over their heads, which is actually a violation of Geneva torture codes.
Yeah. That's just a...
That's torture. It's straight up torture.
Just torture.
I've seen
cool
videos
human rights violations, guys.
100%. I've seen videos of, like, teenagers were just, like, randomly just, like, pacing their cell, and they were strip searched for no reason. And this whole situation, all of it, is just so indicative of how low the police regard Aboriginal lives. So, they just don't care. Like, the fact is, like, this person's suicidal, fuck it, just throw them. Like, I don't care if they kill themselves.
It's not even that. It goes so far beyond not caring. That is an active desire to hurt people.
Yeah.
Like... And this is something that, like, is so evident if you watch footage like that. Like, there's tons of it that comes out of the U.S., but you see officers that, you know, they're on dash cam or someone is recording them, and usually a black person, generally speaking, a young black person, will do nothing.
Nope.
Just nothing. And the officer will take it as a threat on their life, and then just fucking all bets are off, and the officer will beat them within an inch of their life if they don't kill them.
Yeah.
And it's an excuse, because the desire is there to hurt. Like, the goal is to hurt someone.
Yeah.
Not just someone, a black body. And, like, in this case, it would be an Aboriginal body, which I suppose is the same in this context.
Yeah.
But, But, like, it's not a lack of care. They are placed in cells with hanging points on purpose, make no mistake.
Yeah.
It's not an accident or an apathy that causes that to happen. These officers want people dead. They want the Aboriginal people dead. Just based on prejudice and nothing else.
Yeah, and
that's fucking wild to me.
And what's insane, too, is I watched a Vice documentary about Aboriginal legal representation, and as a result of these deaths, there is a law instituted where anytime any Aboriginal is arrested, the police have to call and notify these legal agencies to represent them.
Oh.
Which is honestly great. And in the documentary, they were getting plenty of calls, so they are doing their job. There's a woman who stays up from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. accepting these calls, talking to people, being like a mentor to people that are having drug issues and have been through the whole legal system. Wonderful woman. So Elva is a 28-year-old client service officer, and she takes these calls as she's a proud Indigenous woman. It's a really great documentary from Vice. It's like a 13-minute documentary, but it's called Protecting Australia's Incarcerated Aboriginals. And she said that she's had negative experiences with the police to this day, where she went and she was getting gas for her car, and there was a small disturbance in the gas station just before she had arrived, and she showed up, and the police said, "All you black people need to get out of here." It's like,
neat.
This is current
Just
day.
Straight up.
Yeah,
that's...
And she said that she gets weird, like, people don't understand why there are special client services for Aboriginals. Like, she says people ask all the time, why do you need one specifically for Aboriginals? And she said, we are a large percentage of the prison population and we need special care because people aren't there to support us and protect us. People to this day don't understand, and they think it's a waste of money. Like, they just don't get it. Well, they don't not get it. They don't think it's valuable, right?
Right, because it's not for them.
Right. And it's the same thing of, like, why say Black Lives Matter? Why not say all lives matter? It's
because fucking all lives aren't the ones at risk, idiot.
Yeah, and...
It's insane.
And so here's some stats that are just... This was the first thing that showed up, and this is why I did this episode. So as of 2015, right, there are more, I just picked 2015, the U.S. has the second highest prison population in the world. The first highest it's not the U.S., which is what's important. That's a whole nother episode. So the U.S. has an incarceration rate of 666 adults per 100,000. Sick, that's the Satan number, but moving on. Versus Australia's 162 per 100,000. However, if you focus on the incarceration rate of Indigenous Australians in Australia, which accounts for 2% of the population, the incarceration rate jumps to 2,253 per 100,000. And I looked at the comparison for African Americans in the U.S. African Americans is 1,745 per 100,000.
So close.
Right?
But, yeah.
And also, if you look at the data, there's also numbers that are from, I think, 2014, and the incarceration rate of African Americans had actually dropped, while the incarceration rate of Indigenous Australians had rose. Indigenous Australians went from about 1,700 to 2,200. And
holy shit!
Since 2015, the rates have continued to go up. So it's getting worse.
Why is it getting worse?
There's a lot of reasons. I had to pick my battles. I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to, the fact that Indigenous people are making up 27% of the prison population in Australia, while being 2% of the population, which is wild to me, is I think
crazy.
What it comes down to is just racism. Like, that's not a new fact, but... the police are arresting them for swearing, for things of no consequence. And then these Aborigine people go to their towns and the cops are there, and then they're on edge the whole time because they could walk up to them and instigate something and arrest them for no reason. So, one, they're arresting them for no reason. They're arresting them for unpaid fines, which I'm sure is a huge problem since poverty is rampant in Aboriginal communities. And they get very little to no legal assistance. And then I'm sure paying that back, it's just like that cyclical process of if you can't pay your debts, then you get arrested and you get more debt and you can't pay your debts. I wish I could give you a more definitive answer on what the reason for this is, but there's almost no research done on it because all of the legwork is being done by Aboriginal organizations, which are small and vastly underfunded. I mean, that Vice documentary that talked about the Elva, who runs the Aboriginal client services, had 72,000 views.
Right. That's what I was thinking, is that just people don't know. There's no visibility on it, even in Australia, it seems like.
Right. And I mean, in Australia, it's commonly known because they have to obviously teach the Aboriginal experience in schools and everything. I really just believe they don't care because, I mean, I didn't really know how bad it was. Indigenous Australians are the most incarcerated population of people in the world.
Just period.
Wow. No, nothing compares. Right? Even when they had jumped and you compared African Americans and Indigenous peoples in 2014, which was the year of the riots in, I forget the name, in St. Louis and everywhere during peak year of incarceration, Aboriginals were still incarcerated at a higher rate, just slimly compared to African Americans.
That's crazy.
Which is why I'm so confused I never heard about it, because I don't think that the African American experience is isolated to the U.S. I know it's a global issue, and I know that everybody knows about it because people talk to me about it. So right. I can't understand why nobody is discussing or caring about the fact that Indigenous Australians are to this day the most incarcerated population on the face of the planet, sheerly due to racism.
Yeah, I have no idea why this would be different.
And that's my problem, is I've read reports on it and nobody cares. Nobody's funding the research. And even these communities that are funding the research for these organizations, they're not giving us data. We can't research it if they're not giving us data. So,
man, that's what keeps me up at night. Jesus.
So I don't even know how bad it is.
Right, yeah, anything could be happening.
Yeah.
Shit, dude.
And so
this is bad.
So back to the topic of I think people are doing their best.
Right.
So I do still think that, and that's why this keeps me up at night, because when they interview the police they didn't seek medical attention for this woman because she's a drug addict. They truly believe that they were operating the best they could under the circumstances because they value the lives of Aboriginals so little that was their best. I don't think they're deliberately doing these things because they're I want to be evil. I think they're
well, sure,
whoa, this dude's being kind of combative. Let's tase him 11 times. He's just a drunk guy. He's just someone with something on his record. Oh, the kids, stole a candy bar. Well, they're just an Aboriginal.
And I suppose now that there are bodies involved, it's very easy to be well, this is heinous. And it is. Let me clarify. I'm not saying it's not.
No, yeah.
But I don't believe that the officers thought these people would die. I don't think they cared whether they did. But, I think in the cases of tasing some dude 11 times, although he didn't die, or putting a dude face down, because he had probably punctured lungs or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that they genuinely just didn't give a shit and didn't... I don't think they thought it through to the point where they were going, hey, this guy will probably die, let's do this. I think they just didn't care enough, and it was purely abuse and negligence to the point of, murder.
Yeah.
But I do stand by what I said, that, like, there seems to be, at least, the desire to cause pain.
Yeah.
And, like, we can't ignore the fact that disproportionately people who become police officers, and I'm going to get some heat for this if anybody is a police officer and is listening, but disproportionately it is the truth that, you know, officers are like 40% more likely to be domestic abusers.
Yeah.
Like, some crazy percentage higher to have, like, anger management problems.
Yeah.
These are just, like, stats that we know of, never mind the stuff that we don't.
Yeah.
It's a job that generally is attractive to people who have power fantasies, which is a problem.
Of course. And we're trying to figure out topics as we go on. Eventually, at some point, I've really, for a very long time, wanted to do a whole episode on kind of like the groupthink mentality of the police force, because this is clearly like a chronic problem, because they all like, first of all, just base psychology. This is an old experiment where they found that people, when they have not had relations with somebody of a different race, don't believe that they can experience pain as severely as they themselves can. Like, do you remember this? This was like in the 50s or something. They did it with children.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, like white children believed that black children could withstand more pain because they just couldn't relate to them.
Which is such a crazy assumption to make.
Right? And so that's common with the police force. If you're in these situations where your entire, like, career with the people you're surrounded by, Aborigines are less than people. They're drug addicts. They're abusers. They just think less of them. They make these assumptions of them. They target them, which just creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of institutionalization. And then you treat them roughly because they just can't imagine in their mind that it would hurt severely. They're not going to be gentle, right? Especially if you just make, like, I think the vast majority of crimes were trespassing, but I can't get into the specifics of what that means. But the other ones that are very common are drug-related offenses, not paying fines, and then domestic abuse, which, I'm sorry, are all symptomatic of poverty, because you're using drugs because they have no escape. Drugs are pretty cheap, and they're like, even in reservations, in Indian reservations, Native American reservations, they're very predisposed to alcoholism and drug abuse because it's an isolated system. They can't go anywhere. They can't do anything. It's a coping mechanism. And then they can't pay their debts. And then domestic abuse generally runs higher in environments where poverty is high and drug abuse and substance abuse is high.
Never mind high stress.
High stress, and then also if you're grown in an environment where domestic abuse is normal, you're more predisposed to engage in domestic abuse. Like, they've just created this isolated system, and then they treat them in a way where it reinforces it because they arrest them for all those offenses, which increases their predisposition to engage in all of those offenses.
I do want to clarify on the domestic abuse thing.
Yeah.
There's this sort of idea that domestic abuse is, like, a higher... the population of people who are domestic abusers are higher in Native American reservations or in, like, black communities. This is something that people just sort of generally accept. No, my friends.
No.
It is only more convicted in those communities because there's a higher level of police activity in those areas.
Yes.
It's not a matter of more or less. It's just police are more active there, so they get arrested for it.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And it's also, I think, another contributing factor to like violence in those communities is when you're surrounded by violence. Like, we're creatures that imitate, right? Like, if you're treated harshly, you're going to treat others harshly. Like, it's a system that is designed for them to fail, which is just it's normalizing horrible behavior that gets them in that position in the first place. And nobody cares, and nobody's helping them. And the reason I began this whole episode with the systematic, I'm going to call it genocide, of the Indigenous peoples of Australia is because I think that mentality has never changed. And that's what keeps me up at night, is that this all began with this idea that people who are worthy of living are Christians, and then it was redesigned to be, no, that's a dumb idea. They're lesser than us because of a scientific standpoint, because they're genetically and evolutionarily lesser than us. Then it transitioned to, well, we don't want them to tarnish white blood, so we're going to wipe out their race. And then it transitioned to, no, it has nothing to do with their race. They're just predisposed to not raise their children well and in a good environment. And so we're going to take them away because they're predisposed to violence and drugs and substance abuse inherently, which is all the same thing. It's never changed.
It's just the same attitude with different reasoning.
Right? And it's kind of similar in the US of when you say the incarceration rate of African Americans is disproportionately high, and people say, well, maybe they just commit crimes more, which I'm gonna say it is racist, because it's the assumption that an entire race of people are just predisposed to commit crimes more.
Right.
What?
And that's like fucking crazy. So I think I told you this before off the air. I had a conversation with someone about the episode I did about slavery in America. And I mentioned the point, which is that slavery never ended and that, you know, it's a whole cyclical thing.
Yeah.
And the response I got from the person I was talking to was, well, but don't some of them deserve it?
And it's just horrible. No.
And the answer is just no. Nobody deserves to be enslaved and then systematically abused and killed. Like, what? How could you ever say that? And I was not unclear in my terms of what was happening to these people, and she still said, don't some of them deserve it?
Yeah.
No, they don't.
And, like, that's what's really crazy to me, is that, like, it all comes down to, do you value a human life? And they don't. That's all it is. And you can argue it otherwise, but every justification I hear, like in defense of police brutality, is, well, they should have listened, or maybe they just commit crimes more. And I'm like, no, that's racist. And I don't...
Yeah, you're a racist.
And I don't know how to articulate that to someone who truly believes that these people's lives matter less than theirs. And at the end of the day, I can't. And I can't change someone from thinking these just negative things about an entire race of people. And perhaps if anybody's listening to this and they do believe that if you're just nice to police officers, nothing will go wrong, and if you don't do bad things, nothing will go wrong, consider the history here and consider the baggage of, one, the Indigenous peoples who've experienced nothing but negative relationships with authority, who are predisposed to not really trusting them. And then you have police who have these negative opinions reinforced by behaviors that they choose to do to reinforce it. Like, the kids who feel like they're watched their whole lives, and then they do one bad thing and their record is tarnished, which just affirms to the police that they're criminals, which then keep a closer eye on them. Like, it's all cyclical. And perhaps that's the problem. And even in the reports that I've read from the Indigenous peoples organizations, the only solution that they have is not one of law, but that their lives are just valued less. I mean, the fact that skeletons that were unethically collected from these people from abuse and malnourishment are still overseas in museums.
God, that's crazy.
They just don't care. And that's it. That's the whole thing. You know?
Feels real bad, man.
Do you have anything that keeps you up at night about this? I mean, besides all of it.
Right, just the whole thing. I kind of said it, which is like just the desire to cause pain.
Yeah.
And like thinking, consciously or not, that these people are less than. Like, and it doesn't matter who the population is. Aboriginal population of Australia, black people fucking everywhere, Jewish people fucking everywhere. Like, it doesn't matter who it is, but there's always going to be, like, scapegoat is the wrong word, but, like, a target.
Yeah.
And people in power seem to historically have this tendency to want to cause pain to those they deem lesser than, and it seems to me like they'll find someone. If there's no one at their disposal, they will find someone to hurt.
Yeah.
And that's just a crazy pattern that. And okay, so a long time ago, my family, generally speaking, is pretty conservative. I don't really associate anymore, but like when I was a young kid, my family tried to explain to me what reparations were. And I was young, like really young, and I have no idea why it came up when I was like 10. Like, sit down, child, let me tell you what reparations are and why people want them. And what it was painted to me as is, well, black people want to be paid by the government for doing nothing. And which is just a wild mischaracterization of what reparations are. But for a long time, even when I sort of got the general idea, like, the real definition would be that, you know, black people were enslaved for hundreds of years, and their ancestors want to be repaid by the government for what was done to their families, which systematically made it so that they were incapable of, you know, getting to the level in society where people are now. Our country was founded and continues to be run on principles that are racist inherently.
Yeah.
And so, for a long time, I didn't understand that idea. I was like, well, why should people now be paid for the actions of people hundreds of years ago? And only in the last few years, and I only bring this up because that's a really similar attitude to what you were talking about with, like, the not lawyers, but the activists who talked to Aboriginal prisoners. The attitude of, well, why is that necessary? I don't understand it, so it shouldn't exist. Yeah. I held a sort of similar stance, and I was like, well, I don't understand why this should be a thing because it doesn't apply to me. Yeah. And it never occurred to me that it would be necessary. But when you sit down and do the research and see, like, you go back maybe 5 generations, just a handful, and you see there was never a time when people were set up to succeed. Black people were never set up to succeed.
No.
In America. There was no way. And really, the only way to even start getting equality really put into place is to financially empower these people so that they can actually do things. Yeah. Like, we're talking about people who were systematically placed into poverty, and the same goes for Aboriginal people. And I only bring this up because it is possible to learn more and then change your opinion. It doesn't make you lesser. It just means that you learned something. Yeah. And I implore anybody who's listening who's like, well, they're just drug addicts, they're just criminals, they're just X, to try and imagine a world where you are not just incarcerated, but persecuted for something you can't control. Yeah. These people don't deserve it. It doesn't matter their behavior, really. They don't deserve to be treated like less than human, because they're not. I'm soapboxing now, but, like, Jesus Christ, man, it's just this, and it all comes back to this, doesn't it? I don't know how to make you believe that you should care about people. I don't know how to convince someone of that. Yeah. And the most I can say is just try and do the research and have empathy at the forefront, because it's never gonna be easy to try and apply this stuff to you, because it doesn't apply to you. It doesn't apply to me. It doesn't apply to you, Olivia. Like, we're fucking 2 white girls in the middle of Southern California. Like, this is not really our environment.
Yeah, for sure.
But, like, you gotta give a shit, or else nothing's gonna change. And obviously that's the case, because nothing has.
Yeah. And it's just, I'm sure this is gonna come up, because this is our series on prisons. prisons are clearly not oriented as a means of improving the lives of the people that they're imprisoning. It's just to punish them, but in a way that has long-term effects. And at the end of the day, it's just not a system that's improving anyone's lives.
No.
And that's got to change.
Yeah, the whole thing just... It needs to be reformed to a place of rehabilitation, and right now it just isn't.
Yeah.
This was a rough one, Olivia.
Yeah, this was pretty bad. So Australia, shout out to you.
Way to go, guys.
Yeah. I would also love to hear from anybody that knows of any personal experiences from, like, Aboriginal. If you're Aboriginal, like, I'd love to hear it, because you and I both know, speaking to people in Australia, this isn't really reported on a ton, because, again, most of my information came from specialized websites dedicated to tracking these incarceration deaths or mistreatment. And it's unfortunate. And I don't know if it's just like a common practice to not care, or if it's similar to what people are doing in the US and thinking that Aboriginal people are just being dramatic and are asking for too much, which is horrible. And I guess you learn something new. I always hear from a lot of people at UCLA who are like non-native Americans. Not Native Americans. What I'm trying to say is people who have grown up in other countries, that we're very centered on our issues in the prison system, our issues in racism, and we don't really consider the things that are happening across the globe. And I'm a bit disagreeing about that, because I think that there are things happening in the US that are clearly very important and need to be addressed, and are systematic racial tensions. But I think that is also to a degree true, because I didn't know about this. And there are so many things across the globe that I don't know about, because I think the news does generally focus on race relations in the US without considering everything that's going abroad. And I think it's so critical to focus on the things that need improvement here, but also equally critical to realize that there are also things occurring abroad that are equal in magnitude or even worse. And I guess just consider different perspectives and think about things that are happening globally, because this isn't an isolated system in the US. This is a global problem of not caring about people, which I assume is going to be what this whole series is about. Very excited about that.
I think I know what my topic is, and I was going to do it for a different thing, and now... Now I'm sad, because it's gonna be another one of these where we just feel bad the entire time.
Oh.
We're gonna have to do another positive mini-sode way sooner than I thought.
Yeah, another gong noise. Well, we're doing movie reviews next week. I've forever wanted to review 13 Reasons Why with Brooke, because it's infuriating. But
I read the book, and you watched the show, and I'm just
Did you like the book? Because I remember I read the book. I don't remember it at all, if I'm going to be honest. It wasn't a memorable experience for me, but...
When I read it, I was like, fucking, I don't know, 12?
Yeah.
And like, first of all, I should not have been reading that book.
No.
But also, like, when I was 12, I was like, wow, what a romanticized view of suicide. I didn't say that, but like, it's easy as a 12-year-old to read something like that and be like, this is how it is, and it's normal. And then, you grow up to be, even at 15, I was like, no, that's manipulative and wrong. Yeah. Like, it was all, oh my god, it's so bad. Ugh. Anyway, so I guess that's what we're doing, because Olivia hates me?
I would like to do it. If we want to do something that'll be a little lighter, perhaps we can do something else. But, yeah, that's on the agenda for sure.
Ooh, gross. Alright, well,
I guess on that note, we have social media.
Yeah, I hope y'all are still okay after this episode. This is rough.
Yeah, if you could give us a tweet or talk to us on Instagram at TTKMeUp. We have a website, ttkmeup.com, where you can access our Patreon. We're going to be doing an AMA once we reach $100 a month on our Patreon, and that will be super cool.
Yeah.
If you could leave us an iTunes review or a review on whatever you're listening to us on, we would greatly like it and appreciate it. It's more just the more reviews you get, the more the podcast gets promoted. Plus, it makes us feel good. As Brooke always says, if you say anything negative,
It'll hurt my feelings.
it'll hurt
and
her
I'll be very
feelings and
sad.
she'll be very sad. So
And that's on your conscience, so...
there's a lot on our conscience right now, if I'm going to be honest.
Yep.
We love you so much. Any positive news other than we love you and we appreciate you? And people have been tweeting at us and DMing us, and it makes me so happy.
So nice.
And also, let this prove to you, if you give us suggestions, we listen to you.
We
because
sure do.
I think that this, even if it was sad, turned into great radio.
It sure did.
So,
Yeah, if you send us DMs and suggest stuff, we'll just tear apart your country. So, cool.
hey, that'll be fun. We have a lot of listeners in Sweden for some reason, so if you guys got
pretty
something
cool.
you want us to talk about, hit us up.
Thanks, guys. And yeah, word of mouth is always the best advertiser. If you want us to continue to be able to do this show, then tell your friends and force them to listen to podcasts like I do.
Yep. Especially ours. Play it on a road trip and make them have to listen to it.
Yep.
Do what you gotta
all
do.
30 episodes.
All of them. All right. Thank you all so much. We love you.
Thank you. We do.
Have a good weekend. Or I guess weekend? Yes, because you get this on a Friday.
Yeah,
Have a good weekend.
It's the weekend.
It's been real. Deuces.
See ya.
Bye.
Hey, true crime listeners, check out our podcast, I Said Goddamn. We're a true crime comedy podcast hosted by two besties who like to share messed up cases that make you say goddamn. Every Sunday, we try to one-up each other's story by sharing a horrific case the other has never heard of. Along the way, we splash in some wildly inappropriate jokes and colorful language. Listen every Sunday from any of your favorite podcast directories. Also, follow us on Twitter at ISGD Podcast or visit our website, isgdpodcast.com.